Toward the end of my senior year in high school, my college decision was quite a back and forth process because I had initially agreed to go to one school, a state school in Missouri, but with some late financial aid and a letter that I got, I decided to make my switch to Wheaton College, which is a college in the suburbs out west. Now, going to college is an exciting thing, and some of you are in college yourselves, but paying for it was an incredible burden. And I know some of you are even feeling that right now. But by God's grace and God's providence, I received some scholarships, some financial aid, and also I took out some loans that could help me with it. But as the months of college began to draw close, I started to worry. Because, that money, it covers like the tuition, room and board. But then the question was, how was I going to pay for all the things that you needed outside of that? Like going out to eat off campus, or buying essentials like clothes and books and supplies and even soap. Or maybe, there were events, and if the slightest of chances I could go on dates, then how am I going to pay for that? Like, did I need to work part-time? I had to pay for college for myself because my parents really couldn't help me. Then, the summer before college, I went to this annual Korean church picnic on Memorial Day where all the Korean churches in St. Louis would hang out, they would have games, and have a bunch of good food. And I had completely forgotten that I applied for this scholarship in this Korean American Church Association. And to my surprise, they called my mom and they said I had won the top prize, a $4,000 scholarship for college. I was incredibly grateful, but then I thought, what they're going to do is just call my school and, give that check to the school. And so I'm just going to go to my tuition and, it's great, I'm grateful, but it's not going to help me cover, other costs. But then, to my surprise, as they invited the people up during the picnic and received the certificate, in that certificate was also an envelope. And in that envelope, there was a check with my name on it, at only 18 years old, with $4,000 written to me. And I was shocked. I was like, this is $4,000 with no strings attached. I can buy whatever I wanted. I don't have to send it to be in college. I can use it for my own desires. But then when I got home, my mom pulled me to the side and she said, Noah, this is God's gift to you. Are you feeling this weight? I'm so sorry. And she's like, no, I'm so sorry that your mom, your dad, and I we can't give you much to go to college, but you need to use this $4,000 wisely as you study at school. Your dad and I couldn't go to college, and you're the first generation in our family to go. You need to steward this money because it's not yours, it's God's. I will never forget that moment because every time I had to pay for something in college, go out to eat or whatever, I remembered what my mom said. It's not mine. I'm just a steward. It's really God's. As we get back into our passage, the main question I believe Jesus is asking us and his disciples is, how are you stewarding what God has given to you? If you're wondering, Noah, are you talking about money? Yes, but more than that. I'm talking about your possessions, your investments, your networks, your property, and whatever earthly resource or wealth God has given to you to steward. How are you stewarding what God has given to you? Church, today my title of the sermon, I don't usually start titles, I'm not a big fan of titles even, but I think this is helpful. The title is Shrewd Kingdom Stewards. In this parable, Jesus is painting a picture of what it means to be a steward, what it means to steward our possessions and resources with shrewdness, and I'll explain that more, and also for his kingdom's sake. So for the rest of our time, I want to walk through 3 characteristics of what a shrewd kingdom steward looks like. So number 1, here we go. A shrewd kingdom steward invests in people, not in personal profit. Let's unpack this. And this is really the parable at its core. In verse 1, if you look with me, you can follow along. Verse 1, we see Jesus is speaking to his disciples, okay? Which is a shift. He was speaking to the crowds before, but now to the disciples. And he tells a parable of a rich man who had a manager. So literally, the manager was someone who would steward the rich man's money, his business, and his house operations. This manager also had full authority to make decisions on the master's behalf. So it was an important role. This person would also need to be competent and trustworthy and hardworking. It's what every employer would want in their employee. But then, as we see, charges are brought against this manager for wasting the rich man's possession. This word wasting, it's the same word used when I talked 2 weeks ago about the younger son in the parable when he wasted his father's possessions in a far-off country. So in a way, this manager was a terrible manager. And in verse 2, the rich man says to him, people are telling me how you are wasteful with my things. You are fired. You're relieved of your duties. And notice, the manager doesn't give like a defense. He's not like trying to defend himself. He knows he is clearly guilty. And so in verse 3, the manager is distraught. He's trying to figure out what to do. He doesn't want to do manual labor. He doesn't want to beg. And so then in verse 4 to 7, he comes up with this clever scheme. He still has his master's books. And so back in the day, they had actual books with they wrote on it, and they kept all of the accounts of the master. And so before he handed it over to his master, he got all of his master's debtors, people, most likely wealthier individuals who had probably contracted to use the master's land to grow crops and food. And every year they would have to pay a tax to the master of using his land. And so he summons the manager, the wasteful manager. He summons all these debtors, and then he offers them a chance. And so the first debtor, in verse 5, he asked him, in verse 6, he says, how much do you owe my master? And in verse 6, the man says, I owe him 100 measures of oil, which in that time, or in our day, translation-wise, is about 800 to 900 gallons of oil. That's not a little, and according to some scholars, it's about 3 years' worth of oil that he can grow. And so the manager tells him, cut it in half, which he gladly accepts because a half-price discount is good for any culture. And then to the second one, he goes how much do you owe my master? And in verse 7, if you look, he says 100 measures of wheat, which in our translation would be about 37 to 42,000 liters of wheat, or better yet, 10 years' worth of wheat crop. That's a massive amount. And so the manager says, just cut off 20%, just do 80. And now, as you look, there aren't any more examples, but in the way that the parable is written, we can assume that the manager does this with other debtors as well. There's probably maybe a half more dozen people he's doing this kind of deceitful scheming here. Why? Because this manager knows once he loses his job, is on the streets, these people will feel indebted to him. They will feel a sense of obligation and then extend hospitality to this guy. Perhaps maybe giving him a job or some money or shelter. He also makes these debtors accomplices because they know they got a discount and most likely kind of unrightly. And so they're in this together and they can't lie, and so they need to make sure he doesn't say more things that would get them in trouble. Now, was this manager's actions good or right? No, not at all. He's not only wasteful, but in verse 8, as the master confronts him, he calls him dishonest. He is the worst manager this rich man could ever have hired. Now, this is where the parable gets interesting and also confusing. Verse 8, as we read the first sentence, it says, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Wait, did we read that right? Commended? Instead of punishing the dishonest manager or throwing him in jail and making him pay all that he lost, what does the master do? He commends him. Literally, he praises him. And to give some more context, you know when the last time Luke used this word, commend, in his gospel account? If you go back to the Advent season, when Luke writes how the heavenly host had appeared before Jesus being born, they were praising God. That's the same word. So this master is praising this dishonest manager. How? Why would he commend a manager who is only doing this for his self-preservation? We have to remember this. The master only commends him for one thing. It's his shrewdness. Another way to translate that word, and I have it behind me, kind of more words to help kind of fill in the picture, is that it means to be wise or pertaining to understanding and insight. Or in modern terms, it's a manager who is strategic, clever, and resourceful. So for Jesus, remember, he's speaking to his disciples, or as he says in the end of verse 8, the sons or children of light. He wants them to learn a thing or two from the shrewdness that the sons and children of the world, not his disciples, and how they practice shrewdness. Let me explain it this way. How many of you have heard of a donor-advised fund before? A donor-advised fund, some of you work in finance and banking, you should definitely know this. Now, I'm not totally aware of it, but let me do my best to explain. On the screen behind me, it is a philanthropic vehicle established as a public charity, which allow donors to make charitable contributions, as you can see. You put in cash, your securities like stocks or other assets like crypto or real estate or insurance policies or other complex assets. And then that donor-advised fund account, on behalf of that donor, can send grants from that fund to other charities that person recommends over time. It's kind of like a charitable checking or savings account. You put as much as you want over time and then give to charities through that fund over time. Now, why do people use this? The reason is because these funds help manage tons of administrative tasks and make giving to various types of assets just much easier. Like they take care of all that paperwork and all the details. They also vet charitable organizations to recommend quality ones so that these donors can donate to those that are credible. But also, these donors can maximize their giving by putting their resources in this donor-advised fund. They can avoid some of the high fees or taxes that are associated with it if they give locally or even internationally. So when you hear, and this is, I think this is right, but when you hear of other like many wealthy individuals or CEOs or owners, and they pay so little in like tax or bypass these fees, one way they do this is through these donor-advised funds, which is completely legal to do this. Now, when they do that and when they give, are they always giving to really good things? I mean, sometimes yes, but not always. Well, instead of letting this broader kind of world leverage such an amazing and shrewd and resourceful tool, what some people in the church have done, in 1982, this foundation called the National Christian Foundation started, and they became a donor-advised fund to mobilize resources to see every person reached and restored through the love of Christ, which is their mission statement. Since then, they have helped distribute over $15 billion to over 70,000 nonprofits, ministries, and churches around the world. And then in 2016, to even maximize it, they launched another foundation called TrustBridge Global that helps do the same thing but at a global scale, making giving globally even easier. In other words, NCF and TrustBridge used their shrewdness and the strategic wisdom and resources of the world to not benefit the wealthy or for self-preservation, but as Steve Chapman, the vice president of NCF, said this. He said, "We wanted to do something that would further God's work around the world, to fund countless ministries that feed the hungry, provide water to the thirsty, give homes to the homeless, rescue those in sex trafficking, and support healing and recovery." This is exactly what Jesus is talking about in this parable. In verse 9, Jesus says, and I read it again, he says, "I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth," or another translation is just worldly goods, "so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwelling." Jesus is not condemning wealth or possessions here. Instead, he wants his disciples, and even us, to use it shrewdly and wisely for others, to make friends. And who are the friends of God? As Matthew 25, or even just in the Gospel of Luke, it shares that friends of God are those that are poor, that are hungry, that are lost, that are the foreigner, that are the forgotten, the hurting, the people in his church, those who would benefit from others' generosity. Because when we breathe our last breath here on earth, we won't be able to take a single penny with us. We've heard this before. But Your friends that you gave generously to will be waiting to receive you when you enter heaven's gates. The only thing you can take with you to heaven is, yes, God's presence, but also his people. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, am I stewarding my earthly possessions for my own personal profit, or am I doing it for the people God has called me to love and to serve? How am I using my money for others? What or who are my investments and retirement portfolios for? Do I freely lend my things or invite people into my home? Am I a steward of what God has given to me, or am I using it for my own self-preservation? These are really difficult questions, and these are the questions that Jesus is asking his disciples right now and also to us. Now, that was the parable. Jesus has some more lessons for them after the parable, which leads me to my second characteristic. Number 2, shrewd kingdom stewards are faithful with little, not just in plenty. If you look with me in verse 10, Jesus continues with this parable, or not with the parable, but with the proverb. So a proverb is basically a wise saying, and we read in verse 10, Jesus says, "One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much." Being faithful is not necessarily talking about someone with a lot of faith or spiritual capacity, but Jesus is more so talking about those who are trustworthy, reliable, and dependable. It's just like how I interact with my kids. As we get dinner ready, say for example in my household, I have a 2-year-old son. I don't tell my 2-year-old son to grab that sharp knife and to cut the meat, or to stir-fry the vegetables over an open flame, or even carry all this fragile glassware to the table. That would be incredibly foolish and really bad parenting. I first teach him, hey, here's a plastic plate. How about you take that to the table? Or how about you pick up your food with a plastic fork? Or maybe when you're done with your food, you can practice putting the plate in the sink. Eventually, as you do this over time, you earn my trust, you are faithful with the little things. But on the flip side, if he forgets his plate, if he constantly drops it, or he takes his plastic fork and constantly tries to poke his brothers, I don't think he's getting the responsibility here. I'm going to pull back and I'm going to not give him the other, more potentially even dangerous things that he could do. I need him to learn the basics. And in the same way, it begs the question for us, are we faithful with the little God has given us today? Jesus then takes it one step further in verse 11. If you look with me, he says, similarly, if we're not, faithful with our unrighteous wealth, which again is like earthly goods or possessions, how can we be entrusted with true riches? Or another way to put it, how can we truly handle and appreciate the glorious riches of eternity if we cannot even be responsible for the small earthly wealth that we have today? Jesus is taking this to the extreme. No matter how much you have or little you have, the calling for a shrewd kingdom steward is to be faithful. Because your faithfulness with the little over time gives you credibility to be faithful with much more later on. And I want to bring it back to us, because I know in our church, in our congregation, there's many of us who have just begun our careers, who are in grad school, who are in undergrad, and we probably have more debt than we have money in the bank. And I know what's going on in your mind, because I thought this too, and I sometimes still think this. Noah, I just have so little right now. I'm barely scraping by. I totally get God's desire for me to be a good steward, and one day I will, right? I will. I want to set up a donor or advice fund one day. And when I move up in that new position or become more established or finally settle down with my home and my own family, I'll do that. But for now, I don't think I have enough. I need to save what I can, and I don't have much to give. So can I just wait? Then I'll give. Now, there's nothing wrong with being wise with the resources that God has given to you right now. And as a church, if you are in a season of receiving, we want you to receive. We even have a benevolence fund to give to those who are in need. But let me tell you the hard truth. If you don't start wisely stewarding the little you have now and being generous now, you won't do it later. During a season of life when I was a bit younger and I had to raise support for ministry, Do you know who the most generous people tended to be? Those who had very little. Those who you think would never give. And I learned, and this is not always true, but those who you thought would give and you know have a lot, most cases never ended up giving. Now, this isn't true for every person, I get that, but I share this because if you don't practice wise stewardship and generosity in small ways right now, I don't believe you ever will. So even if you receive a small stipend, or you're in school, or you're living paycheck to paycheck, what are small steps of generosity you can practice towards others on a weekly or maybe monthly basis? How can you be faithful with the little God has given to you? And one of the lessons my mom has always, she does a lot in me. She made sure I knew this time in, time out, was that no matter how much money I received, an allowance, a paycheck, or even that scholarship check, 10% of it, which is known as the traditional tithe, belongs to God. It belongs to His church and to others to bless them. And as crazy as it sounds, even with that $4,000 scholarship check, I took out $400 and I gave it to the church. And it sounds crazy, but that's just what she has helped me to practice. And that's something that I have done even since I was a high school senior. And I'm not saying you have to do exactly that. I'm not saying that. But I urge you, I plead with you to have small steps of generosity that you can practice so you can steward what God has given to you and to do it wisely, to make it regular, to put it on your calendar, to be accountable to someone else. Why? Because there are true heavenly riches that God will give to those who are faithful with the little you have now. Let me move on to the last characteristic. Number 3. Shrewd kingdom stewards are not enslaved to mammon, but serve God alone. In verse 13, if you look with me, Jesus says, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other." And this is the big kind of catch-all line. You cannot serve God and money. That word money in there, it's literally the Greek word mammon, which doesn't really mean much to us today. But in Jesus' time, mammon was often used negatively to describe your wealth, your money, your possessions, or property, or any earthly wealth you had. But to go a bit deeper here, the root word or the origin of that word mammon comes from the Aramaic word of being trustworthy or worth trusting in. So at its core, mammon is describing any earthly wealth that tempts you to trust in it more than our Creator. So the question for us is, what earthly possession do you trust in more than God? Do you trust more in your bank account or your insurance policies for safety and provision than you do with God? Do you trust more in your home or in this country that we live in for protection and justice more than you do with God? Do you trust more in media or that upcoming vacation for happiness and rest than you do with God? Do you trust more in your job or in your resume or in your prestige or your accomplishments more than you trust in the acknowledgement and love in God? When life gets hard and uncertain, when your backs are against the wall, what earthly possession do you reach for? Do you fall back on more than running back to your Heavenly Father? This is why Jesus points out it is impossible to serve two masters. Either we will love mammon and what it can give us and hate God, or we will love God and hate mammon. We'll be devoted to one, and the picture of devoted is like a child desperately clinging on to his mother. It's that kind of clinging. We will cling and to be devoted to one, and we will despise, literally look down upon the other. In other words, you can't have two spouses. You cannot fight for two countries at war with each other. You cannot love both Coca-Cola and Pepsi. It doesn't work, all right? You must love and be devoted to one and despise the other, or use the other for others' sake. Why? Because as one pastor said, money or mammon can be a great servant, but it is a terrible, terrible master. It's quite easy to take this last point lightly because we don't think we struggle with this. Like, even for myself, like, I'm not a slave to mammon or money. I know it's like important and like I'll use it for God, but I'm not a slave to it. I'm going to steward it. That's what I thought. I thought I was good. But I remember a few years ago when our oldest, who's 6 now, Matthias, when he was just born, and after he was born, 3 to 4 months later, my wife Sophia, she goes back to work, and we need to figure out childcare for our son. Eventually, we found an amazing nanny who was a single mom, new to our church before even Hyde Park existed. She was a wonderful woman, and she helped nanny all 3 of our kids at one point. So at first, when we found this out, we were so grateful. I was so thankful and so blessed by this miraculous provision. But then as time went on, there were moments when, as any nanny and person has, she gets sick or her daughter gets sick and she has to cancel and it messes up her schedule. And then after some time, like money was tight for us, and slowly my gratitude began to turn into frustration, and I began to complain, like, why does childcare cost so much? And I started to wonder, like, how much could we have saved without childcare? How much we could have saved for a down payment on a house or a vacation? And then I started to see if I could then maybe have the nanny come less, or move around things, or I got jealous of my friends who had grandparents who watched their kids for free, and I was getting all was happening in my head. And this is also a season when I was trying to tithe faithfully, and I was also in seminary for pastoral ministry to serve the church. But at the bottom of my heart, I still couldn't get over the fact that I had to spend this much money on childcare. And I'll be honest, church, only after some hard conversations and some Holy Spirit conviction, I started to realize how much money and what it could provide held so captive in my heart. It almost became more important to providing loving, safe care for my child. It sounds ridiculous saying out loud right now, and I didn't realize it then, but I wanted to invest more in personal profit, more than the people that were most important to me, and do right to the nanny that was working for us. I was not faithful with this little child, and because what do you know? Later on, God provides 2 more boys, and I had to be responsible for more. It was an increase. I was not serving God. In the end, I was really serving mammon. It dictated my thoughts, my feelings, and even my actions. Church, let me be real here. The greatest lie, after reading this text, you can tell yourself right now, is that you don't have a money issue. The truth is, we all have money issues. We all struggle to steward our mammon shrewdly, wisely, and strategically for others and towards God's kingdom. Imagine if I just pulled up your credit card statement or your spending this past year on the screen and we got to evaluate it. And what would we say? I mean, I'm sure there's some good things, even mine, but it reveals your heart more than you would like it to. The truth is, we are more like the wasteful and dishonest manager than we would like to believe. Many of us prioritize our self-preservation and our self-mini kingdoms more than for God and for others. So what's the solution then? Do we just try harder? Do we just read the Bible more? Do we try to be more generous? Do we try to figure out different strategies? Can anyone be a shrewd, kingdom-oriented steward of all that God has given to them? The answer is no. None of us can do it perfectly. There is sin in us. There is definitely sin around us. It keeps our wallets and our desires curved inwards. What we need is not more advice or more shame or guilt. What we need is the shrewdest, the most generous person to save us. God the Father, who is the steward of all creation and who created it, He chose to generously give us His most precious resource or His precious gift, His one and only Son, to a people all of us who have wasted his resources and lived apart from him in sin. God knew the only way for his lost sons and daughters to be freed from the bondage of money and mammon that has on us was to send his only son to become human like us, live among us, teach us his ways, but more importantly, be crucified on the cross to wipe away all our debt and sin. And the good news, the gospel message, is that Jesus Christ did not stay dead, but that he rose again in 3 days, meaning that death and sin and evil are not enslaved to him or have no power over him anymore. But if you and I choose to believe in Jesus by faith in his death and resurrection, you can receive the same power to not live in slavery to your own selfishness or the god of mammon, but you can live freely as a shrewd, kingdom-minded steward that serves others just like God chose to serve us. Becoming a good steward is not by sheer effort. It's first by truly experiencing the grace and generosity that God has given to you first. It's living in such gratitude of the gift you've received that you steward and you give out of joy and out of happiness and not out of burden. Jesus sacrificed his life, as Scripture says, with great joy to give us new life so that we can also do the same. Let me end with just 2 practical or tangible things you can do in this from this sermon. And I have it on the screen. The first one is to pray for a transformed heart. You know, stewardship and generosity do not happen with more willpower. I mean, you try it. Just try it yourself. It doesn't happen that way. It happens when God truly transforms your heart. So honestly, even as you take communion later, even as you pray on your own and you consider things going on in your life, I ask you to pray, God, give me a generous heart that stewards what you have given to me. Pray that God would root out the self-preservation, the selfishness, the idols, the things that are basically what the world wants you to pursue and buy, but so that you can see God and be more generous. Number 1, pray for a transformed heart. And the second one on the screen you can see is take one consistent step to be generous. Remember being faithful with little. It's not how much you give, it's in what heart condition and how often you give. It doesn't need to be crazy, but it can be regular. You know, it could be a tithe to the church. I'm not going to force, it is a faithfulness of the church and a responsibility of those who are part of the church body, but it may be something else for you. It may be buying someone lunch once every week. It might be supporting a new ministry or work in the city that's in need.